Welcome to Aspire, and I Have the Right to podcast, where we amplify voices, share stories, and drive change in the fight against sexual assault. We explore the critical issues surrounding student safety, institutional accountability, and survivor empowerment. In every episode, our goal is to provide insightful conversations with survivors, experts, educators, and advocates, giving you, our listener, valuable information, resources, and actionable steps to create safer environments and cultivate a culture of respect and consent.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the I Have the Right to Aspire podcast. I'm Chessy Prout, and I'm here today with my co-host and mother, Susan Prout.
Hi, Chess. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us. Aspire was created by our nonprofit, I Have the Right to, as a space for honest, meaningful conversations about survivor advocacy, prevention, and what it truly takes to create safer communities. This podcast is about learning together, leaning into courage, and uplifting the voices of people who show up every day to drive real, lasting change. Before we jump into our conversation with today's guest, whom I'm so excited about, award-winning writer Soraya Chemaly, we want to take a moment to introduce our equally exciting intern, I Have the Right to guest who will be joining us as co-host for this episode. Chessy, I'll turn it over to you to introduce Meghan.
We're so excited to have our intern, Meghan Boudreau, on the podcast today. Meghan has been with us at I Have the Right to for a little bit now, and she's a recent graduate of Allegheny College. She's also studying to get her master's in social work at NYU. Meghan, we're so thankful for you and the work that you do at I Have the Right to, and are so excited you're here with us today for this conversation with Soraya.
Thank you guys so much. I'm honored to be a part of this conversation.
Now, we are so excited and grateful today to be in conversation with the incredible Soraya Chemaly. She is, as my mom mentioned, an award-winning writer, journalist, and activist whose groundbreaking work explores the intersections of gender and culture, politics, religion, and media. Among your books and writings are The Resilience Myth, Rage Becomes Her, and now All We Want Is Everything. Your work also appears on Substack and in many other national publications. It is one of the leading voices challenging how we think about women's rights and roles in both public and private life. We're so grateful to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Chessy and Susan and Meghan. I'm very happy to have this chance to talk to you.
Soraya, on the back cover of your book, All We Want Is Everything, it says, all we want is dignity, equality, authority, safety, independence, kindness, liberation, peace, revolution, agency, respect, freedom, security, wellness, everything. I am so grateful that you are talking about our rights to our fullest humanity. This is exactly why we formed I Have the Right to teach communities of what can happen. But before we dive into your new book, I'd love to hear from you how you arrived at this moment in time to write All We Want Is Everything.
Well, Susan, I think, interestingly, my first book, Rage Becomes Her, and this book were both bookends around elections. So I wrote Rage Becomes Her after Donald Trump's first election, and I wrote this one after he was elected, but truly before he was elected. It came out after he was elected. Because I think that those two moments were so roiling, so culturally explosive in every way. And in both instances, it just seemed as though gender as a fulcrum of power was very obvious to some of us, but not to others. And so I wrote this one because no matter who won the 2024 election, there was going to be a massive backlash. And it would be white supremacist and it would be male supremacist. But I think it's very hard for people to think of those things together. The culture kind of already is grappling with the words white supremacy, is not particularly keen on the words male supremacy either. And putting them together is difficult, I think, but necessary. So I wanted to just write a short, punchy primer about what this looks like and how it is that backlash has happened in response to our dismantling it. It's not that I'm being prescriptive and saying, this is how we are going to do it. There are things that we can reliably talk about. But I'm really saying, look at what has happened. Look at this revolution that has happened in slow motion with very little acknowledgement to transform the world.
So much of that sort of the reaction that you just described of the reasons why you've written the last couple of books that you've written around the elections, when you said that there's going to be outrage with either candidate being elected, it was such a poignant reminder that even though we live in a patriarchal, male supremacist, white supremacist culture, those men are never going to be satisfied with the amount of power that they have. And to hear you say that there would have been outrage if there was still outrage when Donald Trump, their leader, or some of their leaders, was elected, is so frustrating because it proves that no matter how much power they have, it will never be enough because we still have our humanity, which is terrifying to hear as a human, not even as I don't want to qualify myself as a woman to hear that, because one of the most frustrating things to hear is men who say, well, I have a daughter, I have a wife, I have a mother. No shit, we all have moms. If you're in this world, you have a mom. That shouldn't you shouldn't have to have close relationships with women to have to care about them. You know what I mean? Like,
well, that's a whole patriarchal frame.
Right. But it's so blatantly obvious. And you outline this in the first couple pages of your book, how oblivious men are to the power that they have. And can you explain to our listeners a little bit more about that sort of obliviousness and what it might take to change the sort of defensive culture that we live in, where if you call somebody out for a privilege that they have, our immediate response is to be defensive?
Right. Well, first of all, maybe it would be helpful as a baseline to actually define male supremacy, because I think that's important. Because what I'm trying to show in the book is that there's a very high price to pay for everyone in supremacist systems. And those systems are very hierarchical, pretty binary in every way, black, white, male, female, cis, trans. And they can only really be maintained through dominance cultures of violence, right? So that's true in all forms of supremacy. With male supremacy, I think the inclination is for people to think all men are oppressing all women, which is, first of all, wrong. Secondly, oversimplification. And the truth is, most men are also disadvantaged by systems of patriarchy and male supremacy. And so male supremacy as a defined term by the Institute of the Study of Male Supremacism, I'm actually going to read it because why fumble through it when they did such a good job thinking about it? Their definition is the belief in cisgender men's superiority and right to dominate, control, or erase quote-unquote others, women, trans, and non-binary people, and those with indigenous gender and social roles. And I would modify that by saying one of the key levers in male supremacy is to exert power in a way that feminizes oppressed people. So if you think about Black men in society historically, they have always been denied the abilities that define the abilities and the privileges in a society that define white manhood: ownership of guns, ownership of property, access to all women freely. There's a whole array of things. And by denying Black men those things in society, they are effectively feminized. So I'll add that to male supremacy. But to get back to your question, which I think is, how do we talk about the defensiveness that comes up when we indicate that privilege is at play? Because the word privilege is so reviled because, in fact, most people don't feel like they're privileged. They're just leading their lives. And a lot of people haven't given any thought to how it came to be that they are leading the lives they're leading, right? And so we know that with white supremacy, we have a term, white fragility, it describes the emotional response to confronting facts about history or power dynamics. And So denial is one, defensiveness is another, anger is a third response. And we see that too when we talk about sexism, women's rights, and particularly if you talk in terms of male supremacy, right? I think that a lot of men feel that it's a personal attack as opposed to a critique of a system. And that's also built into the way it sustains itself, right? These are massive global systems. No one person constructed them, or very few one people can maintain them, right? But those emotional responses are a form of identity protective cognition. When you encounter information that makes you doubt your beliefs or yourself or your goodness, you're going to reject those things. And we see that not just in terms of social power, but also in terms of science. So conservative white men are much, much, much more likely to deny climate science than anyone else in the society because it threatens their identities in their sort of worldview. And the response is the same: denial, defensiveness, anger, hostility. Getting around that is hard. You know, I don't pretend to say that it's easy or that there are clear steps. But in the book, I talk about male fragility as a corollary to white fragility because it shares the same mechanisms.
And at the end of every chapter in your book, you create these male supremacy and X sort of indexes that I think are extremely helpful and are also the mechanisms in which to call out people in their sort of not badness, but in the ways that they uphold patriarchy. And so one of them that I wanted to pull out and say on the podcast was the Male Supremacy and Culture Index. And I'm just going to read out a few of these numbers that you shared in facts and figures. So for every 10 mentions of a woman journalist on X, she gets an average of 168 abusive comments. 23 minutes is the time it takes a user on TikTok or YouTube to be fed unsolicited manosphere content. 200,000 to 300,000 is the average number of women in large city "are we dating the same guy" groups. 96% of non-consensual sexualized deepfakes target women, and 0% of social media platforms are owned by women. 90% of social media platforms are owned by white men. So in calling out these inequalities, inequities, I'm trying to think about the best way that a person who upholds these systems can take in that information and recognize their role in upholding these systems.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, first of all, I know that you personally, as I have had the experience of being targeted online, both as a person, as a family. So that does give you an understanding that is sad and personal. And I think it's super hard for many people to even imagine what that's like. Because in fact, it's so cruel, it's so unhinged and ugly that you wonder what happened to these people, right? Like really and truly, what happened? And in fact, I think what happened is the formation of supremacist identities and the cultivation of cruelty in the society that we're now seeing at scale. It's not that it's new, it's just that it's visible. And that's the paradox of all the badness online. You know, I've spent 15 years writing about it, experiencing it, researching it, and I know the badness, but there is part of me that feels like, well, if what it takes is for everyone to see it, then that's where we are. You cannot put that genie back in its bottle, you know? And so there is the fact of knowing it that maybe didn't exist before. There's also just, I think, a quality of witnessing. Like if you think about what happened on X at the beginning of the year with Grok, many people were surprised by that. But nudifying apps are a complete sector of the industry. Tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of men are using nudify apps, and boys. It's just that putting it on Grok escalated it in a way and put it into a mainstream format that had prior to that stayed a little distant. But nothing about what happened on X was new or different, really. You know, it's just that it was an amplification. What is, I think, harder for people to understand is that even those attacks where women are sexualized, where they're depicted in pornographic violence, where men are saying, make her smile or make her look bloodied and bruised, which is what's happening. the intent isn't actually to hurt the individual being portrayed. The intent is to send a signal to others that we can do this with impunity and you can't stop us. And in fact, the second sort of consequence is the fortressing of spaces. So X, since Elon Musk bought it, has become dominantly much, much more skewed towards men than women. And that's true compared to all other platforms. This kind of behavior allowable on the platform makes that even more likely because women are forced to be silent or forced to cede the public space, which is the purpose of the sexual threat, right? It doesn't matter if it's technical sexual threat or street harassment. The purpose is the same. It is to control the space that people are in. And so I don't know if it makes a difference that now more people see it happening, or even that more people understand it can happen to anybody at any time. You don't even have to post a picture, right? So for women, the risk has gone from maybe I shouldn't walk at night in that place, or maybe, I need to take an Uber when I'm traveling abroad, or the risk has gone from that kind of assessment to, well, I exist. That's it, right? Because literally the lesson is any guy anywhere can turn you into a pornographic object for the entertainment and profit of other men, which is more or less the way that equation works, because there are a lot of women involved in that chain of events.
And it's so interesting, too, the publicizing of those images and those processes. How much is that causing shame in the people perpetrating it versus letting them know you're not alone? People are doing this and getting away with it. That is extremely frightening, and why I feel like getting to kids younger and younger to talk about these social and emotional issues is so important, because we're doing so much of life alone, especially with the internet. You're alone in a wild world of no rules. The internet is so unregulated, especially for kids of younger ages. There's not a lot of parental controls that
or knowledge.
You're right.
They just don't know.
Meghan, I want to turn it over to you in a minute, but I just want to add to this conversation that women can participate in this as well. And thank you for acknowledging what's happened to our family online. There is a woman who has dedicated the last 6 years of her life. She's an executive in the entertainment business, and she has fixated on Chessy's case, and she has attacked advocates, attacked any supporters, attacked our family in their place of work by harassing them and coming up with these conspiratory theories that it's all part of some child abuse ring and kickbacks with the police and the government. And it's insanity. And she's actually gotten into the MAGA group now, where they are investigating the New Hampshire Coalition against sexual violence in the legislature. So I just want to get your comments about women who support this misogyny.
Susan, I think that's a very important question, because I think that a lot of people think that women somehow are born with feminist consciousness, that they're born with social justice running through their veins and not subject to the culture that they are raised in, not subject to socialization. In order to come to a sense of the world's wrongs, you usually, if you're comfortable, have to experience it in some way. You have to see it, you have to witness it or experience it. If, however, those two things don't happen, or if you benefit from the injustice, you're going to be much more prone to systems justifying. And as we can see today, there are more than enough women who are systems justifying in the same way that men are systems justifying. And so there's nothing intrinsic in women that would mean they're less patriarchal, less misogynistic, even though you would hope, right? And so we see that on the right-wing women, and I highly recommend reading Andrea Dworkin's Right-Wing Women again, because it's still relevant today, 50 years later. But right-wing women believe the same things right-wing men do. They have a separate spheres ideology where women have one world and men have another world, and they have gender roles that are hierarchical, and they're okay with that. There's complementarianism in religion. There are all of these institutional rewards, everything from our taxation system to our education cultures. And so there's a lot that women can find beneficial. That's what sort of benevolent sexism looks like about that system. And this woman is clearly threatened by what your family is saying. And who knows the cause of her being threatened, but that is the mechanism causing her rage and her conspiracy theorizing. And I think that's pretty common.
Thank you, Soraya, for sharing all of this insight. So many of our listeners are working in education and prevention, and here at I Have the Right To, we try to teach early on in educational spheres preventative measures for cases such as this. And we were wondering, how do you think feminist theory specifically can be used to shape a healthier understanding of consent, especially in the digital world that we've been talking about this morning?
Well, I think that operates on lots of levels. If we talk about the biggest scope, which is the industry itself, it is built on principles of non-consent, and I don't think we should ignore that, right? AI's harvesting of writers' words, for example, the way that data flows work without people's consent, surveillance systems that are embedded. Like, I just want to put that out there as the macro non-consent overlay of everything we're talking about. I think that clearly feminism is the reason why we use the word consent in this way that you're talking about, right? There's decades now of feminist work about the importance of consent, bodily autonomy, healthy sexual and emotional relationships, sexual freedom, gender fluidity. All of these things, they're all dimensions of the same issues. I think that maybe one thing that feminism could emphasize more is creating educational materials that are specifically calibrated to early childhood development. And I mean, Nordic countries have done that. There's no reason why we couldn't do it, except the cultural and political fraughtness of that. The right really has seized education and seized school boards and is defining what sex ed looks like and what books people should read. And in some ways, that's very limited because, in fact, people are going to find what they want. Water will find a way, and that's what will happen here. But it does create obstacles, and it means that the baseline culture is not focused on what it means to have consent, to have autonomy, to have mutual respect in a relationship. That's not the way the rights culture of teaching children about sex works. But the fact is, we're teaching children about sex all the time without ever saying the word sex. Right? We're teaching them about consent all the time without talking about consent. We're teaching them these things when they're playing together, when we're, helping them through difficult times or when discipline is necessary. So I think it helps to think about a general approach to other people, the self-other relationships that we have, and to remember that it's important not to create self-other relationships that are unremittingly hierarchical and authoritarian in their essence. A lot of parents have authoritarian parenting styles, and the result of that is that you end up with authoritarian-minded children, which is what we have in our authoritarian-minded adults, which is what we're dealing with right now. So I think feminist parenting is really critically important politically.
Can I jump in with a follow-up to that super quick? Could you talk more about what you called it feminist parenting models? Can you talk more about what that would look like?
I mean, I think that's such a good question. I think it's one thing is not asserting your power as a parent just because you have it in a certain way, right? You can be a caring, protective, good parent without it being a rigid, hierarchical, do it because I told you to do it approach, right? If there are different types of parents, right? Generally, the framework is authoritarian, authoritative, and permissive. And those three models kind of align with what we're talking about. If you're an authoritative parent, you're trying to straddle the other two. One that is much too rigid and hierarchical, top down. And honestly, that the authoritarian parenting style, to me, is just so closely tied to American religiosity. Evangelicals, Catholics, I grew up Catholic, have intimate familiarity with that parenting style. But that parenting style is very much, there is someone at the top and there is someone at the bottom. And there are rules and you will obey them or you will be punished. That's the basic model of that style of parenting. Authoritative parenting is, let's talk about this. Let's figure out what the problem is. I'm going to help you learn to think a little about approaches. It's much more give and take. It's much more egalitarian in the way power can move between a child and a parent. And permissive parenting is permissive. It is actually less a matter of back and forth, and maybe the sharing of information and the respect for a child's dignity or selfhood, and more do what you're going to do and you'll learn. I'm not participating so much in that. And I think that's kind of a good framework to think. I think of feminist parenting as squarely in the middle there.
Yes, I think we should jump to your question about the second grade experience.
Great. So in your book, you share an experience that your daughter had in the second grade with a boy who had a crush on her and was upset when she didn't reciprocate the same feelings. Now, the boy's mother then got in touch with you and asked you to ask your daughter to acquiesce to his advances to, quote, make him feel better. And you said something really powerful back to that parent, saying it's not your daughter's job, but his parent's responsibility to teach him to accept rejection and navigate disappointment. I had to sit with that for a while and would love to hear, where did you learn to say that and how can everybody else also learn that?
I mean, I learned to say it through hard personal experience, to be honest. And I learned to see it because I had 3 daughters and knew immediately that I did not want to be a vector of patriarchal values, that I had been forced to grow up in that way, but that there were alternatives. And so sometimes crept up on me without my understanding it, and other times it was crystal clear. And this time it was very crystal clear because this boy was very sweet, innocent, there was no malice in what he was doing, but he was quite obsessive about it. He insisted on sitting with her, trying to hold her hand, following her around the playground. And it became troubling to her, embarrassing to her. Kids were, making little rhymes about them. And she was not participating in this. It was entirely governed by his desire for these things to happen. And at one point, he made a gift for her and maybe wrote her a letter, and she gave them back to him. Like she gave him back the letter, and he was upset. He insisted that she take the gift. And so she was quite upset when she came home, but she had not reciprocated, and she didn't say thank you. She was angry. She was like, I've been saying no. I asked my teacher not to sit next to him, all of these things that she tried to do. And then his mom, who I knew, a very lovely person, she called and she did, I think, what a lot of mothers, particularly mothers of boys, would do, which is say what I said at the beginning, which is, he's so sweet. He just likes her. Do you think she could acknowledge it? And I said, she has acknowledged it. She has acknowledged it, and she has said no. That's the acknowledgement. And that's really hard for some people, right? And yet we all know the long tail, disastrous and violent effects of what happens when women say no. And men who do not expect to hear no or believe that persistence is going to wear a woman down don't get what they want. And so unless we address that in childhood and we get better about teaching boys that there are limits to their desire, to their actions, we're going to keep reproducing this, and for that boy's emotional competence, it probably was a good lesson. I don't know what happened after that, honestly. He's not my child. But to actually sit with a child, any child, because we do this with girls by default. Girls build limits into their identities by the time they're 8 or 9. They don't ask for too much. They don't center themselves. They don't make demands. They fold their sense of injustice into their bodies in ways that become self-destructive. Like, all of that happens. It's also not healthy, which is why in Rage Becomes Her, I really conclude with why emotional competence as a childhood skill to be developed is so critical for everyone, right? It's not just that boys need to handle rejection. It's that we don't really talk to people about their emotions and how to name them and then make sense of them and then act on them with compassion for themselves and others.
Thank you for that, Soraya. And I just want to say thank you as a parent of also 3 daughters. And I raised my daughters in a foreign culture to us, or mostly foreign to me, I guess. My children are all a quarter
I
Japanese.
did too. Here.
And, for any parent out there who's listening, you do learn kind of trial by fire sometimes. And I think I grew up with authoritarian parenting, and I thought, okay, strict bedtime, strict eating, schedule, and all these things. And I had to learn with 3 daughters who are all very different too. Their personalities were very different on how to build their self-esteem and their learning, in different situations. And my girls went to a Catholic all-girls school,
Yeah.
which actually I would say in a foreign country was very, very different than the typical Catholic all-girls school. And I do have to say there was a wonderful takeaway from that experience in my daughters believing in the power of their voices. And, they went to school with kids from over 50 different nationalities. And wow, if we could just build that into every school, we would be in a much different situation right now in the
We
world.
would.
Yeah. But I'd like to ask you, and thank you for that question before, Meghan. You describe emotion as a kind of intelligence. How can that idea strengthen how we talk about consent and communication?
That's such a good question. So, first of all, I would say we should acknowledge that our culture associates emotions and emotionality with irrationality and femininity and denigrates emotions as a result. Emotions, for example, are supposed to taint our thinking. And if you look at the right and its hypermasculinist ideology, and you look at a place like X or the tech industry, hypermasculinized sectors, economics and tech, you'll see the degree to which those cultures, even women in those cultures, want to strip emotion out of their expression. And that's tied to a sense of superiority, right? That the emotions make you inferior in some way. And so what's lost there is the reason why we evolved to have emotions, which is to navigate the world, build relationships that enable us to thrive and survive, and impart intelligence about our lives and what we need. Every emotion we have serves a purpose, and to ignore that or to turn it into a weakness is part of the overall disaster that we're in, right? That bifurcation of humanity into the rational, the irrational, the logical, the emotional, that's really corrosive and damaging, not just to us as individuals, but to our education systems, to our economic systems, to our political system. And so, yeah, I think that every effort we can make to raise emotion and people's understanding of the role of emotion is super vital, And in fact, the way our cognition works, which I think is hard to wrap the brain around because of the way we're socialized, is that before any logical thought happens, we've had the emotional response that generates the logical thought, and the emotion works so quickly and it's so entirely embodied, our nervous systems, our brains, like everything, and it's unconscious. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean we can't slow down and think, what is happening here? So, for example, climate deniers believe that they understand science better than everybody else. But in fact, what's happening is they're engaging in this defensive, emotional, identity protective cognition. And if you don't understand that, you're never going to understand climate science denial because it makes no sense. It makes no sense to deny climate science, right? And so I just think it's important for us to constantly be shedding light on what emotions are, what they do, and why they're so important to acknowledge as a form of intelligence.
Soraya, I really appreciate how you've almost reclaimed what feminine rage looks like and means in such a way that's so powerful and so accessible. And it's incredible the work you do in your writing. And I have
Thank
to
you.
ask, what inspired you? It's a twofold question. So, what inspired you to write Rage Becomes Her? And how has your understanding of women's anger evolved since its publication?
What inspired me? That's such a good question. There's probably no time in my life when I wasn't inspired to write Rage Becomes Her. I think I had a very, very early childhood sense of social injustice, which actually might be tied to my very, very late possible ADHD. That might be one thing. But anyway, I grew up in a colony, in a British colony that was extraordinarily racist, sexist, homophobic. And that's really incoherent for a child. If you're a child and you're looking around your world and what adults are telling you doesn't make sense and is wrong, you think about it. And most children have to be taught all of those things. They have to actively be taught to be cruel to other people, which is what these systems do. So I just feel that I had a pretty well-developed feminist sensibility by the time I was 9 or 10. Like, ask any sister of a brother in particular what happens. This is just the small personal slights, but any sister who's told to get up and clear the table when her brother is not will tell you that she understands feminism, you know? So there's that early, you know. But as I said before, the election prompted me to write this particular book because it was so clear that the men running for the presidency could leverage anger, populist anger, their own anger, political anger, in a way that women can't. And certainly not women running for office. And that was it was so stark in 2014, 15, 16. So it seemed like a good way. Anger was a good sort of Trojan horse to talk about all the other things because it reflected this fundamental difference that we're all supposed to respect, that anger makes men better leaders, for example, but it means women can't be leaders. Like, this is ridiculousness that we're expected to just go with. So that's what inspired me to write it then.
It's so interesting to recognize the anger that a lot of activism is fueled by. My mom and I showed my mom a TV show yesterday that I watched that my sister told me to watch called His and Hers on Netflix.
Oh.
And yeah, so many things to unpack in that TV show. But one of the repeated sort of soliloquies that one of the main characters says in voiceover is that rage hurts, and I'm paraphrasing here, rage hurts people, but it can also fuel a person. And in the last couple of days, weeks, months, years, I've recognized my own rage, especially when it comes to things that are happening politically and socially. And as I'm feeling that rage, I also recognize it, or am inherently recognizing it as a bad feeling, as something that is dangerous, that my rage and anger is dangerous and is harming myself. That's something that I was told a lot during the trial and the criminal investigation of my abuser, that the anger that I held on towards him and my old community was only hurting myself. And I had a hard time coming to terms with that because and I'm still coming to terms with it and understanding why I don't agree with the fact that that anger is only hurting myself, because then where should it go? So my question around this ramble is, what advice would you give to somebody who has been taught their entire life to suppress anger, that anger is bad, anger is hurtful to you and others, but it's an emotion that we feel?
I mean, that is another reason why I wrote this book, right? I mean, there's not a woman alive who wasn't taught that lesson. And particularly in the United States, white women. White women learn to associate shame with anger. Generally speaking, most men don't by socialization because anger is so conflated with masculinity, right? Which is very, very destructive to boys and to our political system right now. But I think that it's interesting because you use the word rage. And what I basically am saying in Rage Becomes Her is by the time rage happens, it's already dysfunctional. You don't want to get to the point where you're feeling rage. That means that the anger has had no uptake. No one's been paying attention. The signals of your anger have been suppressed or repressed or diverted into harmful behaviors, right? So I want to make that distinction. The thing about anger, we have it, all of us, because it is the signal emotion. It tells us when something wrong is happening. It warns us of a threat. It indicates that we need to make some kind of change. And we learn to think of it as isolating, mainly because we're told to keep our anger to ourselves. Don't be rude. Don't be angry. Don't make demands for yourself. Put others first. Be kind. Or be nice, which is different from being kind. And so that becomes dysfunctional, right? It becomes a driver of a whole host of illnesses that we associate with women. And it contributes to autoimmune disorders, self-harming behaviors, disordered eating. Those studies are very clear. And so what we want to be able to do is, first of all, recognize the emotion. I was so socialized against anger that I didn't even remember what it felt like in my body. I would call it anything but anger, really. And so, for example, again in the United States, women will repeatedly say they're sad when what they are is angry. They just can't say that they're angry because, in fact, a lot of punishment comes with saying you're angry. A lot of social isolation enforced by families or communities, like your community, telling you don't be angry and then pushing you away for making demands, right? And then this is the third thing I will say about anger. We think of it as isolating, but in fact, it's the most social emotion because 9 times out of 10, your anger is telling you that the people around you, whoever it may be, your family, your friends, your coworkers, intimates, strangers, that you need them to do something to help you. You're expressing a need, you're identifying an injustice, and you have to connect to say, how can we change this together? What are you going to do? Something happened and it needs to change. And that's really what people don't want, right? They're not so much policing the anger as the relationships that the anger will alter.
And understanding anger in that way as an indicator of injustice or something not being right in these interpersonal relationships. For the educators that are listening, parents that are listening, how can they then recognize a child's anger as not something to shame the child for or punish them for? Even when a child uses that anger to harm another child, how can we properly recognize the harm that's been committed or the gravity of their anger while also helping them in the long run?
Well, honestly, I think the first step is that most adults also don't have emotional competence and fluency. And so that's a big obstacle to what you're talking about, right? It's not just that we need to be able to better teach children to understand what's happening in their own bodies and lives, but that adults struggle with this for different reasons. People have different reasons. But I would say it's important if you're going to be parenting other people to first interrogate your own resources. How was I raised? How was I parented? What biases do I have that I'm unaware of? We all have them, right? Like the first couple of chapters of Rage Becomes Her are literally about the way that we don't even realize how we're gendering emotions for children. Like people will look at babies, some babies dressed in blue, some babies dressed in pink. The babies are all acting the same way. But if the baby is dressed in blue, they'll say that the baby is angry and disagreeable because it's a boy. But if it's dressed in pink, they'll say that the baby is needy and vulnerable because it's a girl. Same behavior, just changing the clothes, right? And so that carries through adulthood. We do that constantly. So I think self-awareness about emotions, better knowledge about biases, and then again, this not authoritarian but not permissive style of engaging with a child that respects them in their own selfhood and their own personhood while still keeping them safe and teaching them how to develop. And I think it's true of teachers too, right? Teachers have the same biases.
Soraya, we could listen to you all day. There's so much work to be done. And
Well, thank you for all you're doing.
I'm really proud actually that we've arrived at this point after, being affected by sexual violence now for 10 years in our family and by what happened to Chessy. There's so much more I'd love to get your opinion on, but I really would like to ask you, how do we inspire the continuation of this work to build a consent-based culture on a school community level and a societal level? But there's so much I want to also ask you about the emotional labor that women are charged with. That's something that I've started to reflect on more in my family, and I've talked about it with family members. So there's so much work to be done, and the whole idea of, you know, I just want to also comment, I am still amazed, Chessy. You were raised from 6 months old in an Asian culture, Japanese to be specific, and yet you were able to use your voice, which in a culture where the nail that sticks up has to be hammered down, where we don't um, disrupt the continuum of quiet, and yet you were able to speak up, and I still think that will be one of my biggest blessings that I will leave this life with, that you were able to do that. But on the other hand, we have so much more work to do, of how women are socialized to minimize confrontation, and boundaries and consent are not something we feel entitled to. How can we inspire this group of interns and students and young women, Soraya, to not give up and to keep moving forward despite this administration, despite the rise of the manosphere and everything that is happening around us on a daily basis?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I feel like Gen Z needs to inspire the rest of people because Gen Z women they're not trying to everyone become an activist, for example. They're literally leading their lives. And it's a cliche, but they're being the change that they want to be. And that's very clear. 30% of Gen Z women have rejected heteropatriarchal identities and roles. They're queer, lesbians, bi, they're trans, they're living in communities that um, are changing life. I'm glad you mentioned this way because I think it brings us full circle. What I am trying to articulate in All We Want Is Everything is that we are the revolution. Even the most conservative activist is leading a feminist life today compared to 30 years ago, right? That woman who is harassing your family, she can have her own bank account, drive her own car. She probably went to school. Like, okay, fine. She's being an asshole. But in fact, the entire system has leveled up to a place where we take those things for granted. And that didn't happen because we had a feminist president. It happened because we just put our heads down and went to school and lobbied for change and got some laws passed and built solidarity with other movements, which we need to get much better at, right? And so I just think that the reason there's so much focus right now on the right on trad wives and baby making is because they understand the threat posed by young women who will not transfer their values the way they did by default before. So I actually think the trajectory of mentorship, I always think this. I always say this, young people should be mentoring up. Really, they should be mentoring up. We shouldn't be saying, this is again authoritarian. Authoritarianism, parenting will tell you older people need to impart their knowledge. And I'm like, that's just not working out so well. Like, that has really fucked things up. So let's not do that, you know? And younger people, they understand media. They are immersed in a reality that a lot of older people don't understand, can't see, and definitely can't navigate. Like, that's why we have QAnon and MAGA, and that's really scary on the kind of epistemic level. So I just think I would much rather be inspired by looking at the way young people are leading their lives. And we know that the two biggest voting blocks, the two most progressive voting blocks, are young women and the oldest women. The women in between who still have basically family responsibilities, can't afford it. They literally can't afford to be rebellious in those ways. But that doesn't mean they won't age into it. It also doesn't mean Gen Z won't become more conservative when the hard realities of having children hit in this country.
Beautifully said. 100% with you on that. That makes so much sense that women can't afford it in the middle sector. And I just want to say one more thing. You have written, the point is not to hurt men. A conclusion that can be accomplished only by centering men again. It is to transform the nature of power and the identities that make exploitive male domination rather than healthy interdependence, the starting point of intimate social political relationships. That is exactly how we go into schools. We acknowledge we are apolitical. We go in with the proverbial carrot and stick. We show men that they are boxed in by these tropes, and that to be truly healthy and whole, they need to think about all the emotions they're taught to suppress and and we're seeing it in our students. Our students come from all different areas of the country, and the kids in the most urban areas truly seem to me that they are understanding that the world is much more beyond the finance realm, and they're learning that they can lean into their other interests. And so we're really encouraged by the young people we talk with at I Have the Right To.
Yes.
So I will leave it with that from my point of view. Meghan and Chessy, help us wrap up this incredibly inspiring conversation with Soraya with your final thoughts and questions.
Soraya, I just have one more question for you. In your new book, All We Want Is Separating, you write about the urgency to dismantle the current patriarchal systems in our politics. Can you define what your vision of true democracy looks like in a communal sense?
I think I probably can't. That's just a wild imagining in my mind. I can tell you, I can more negatively define it. I think clearly sort of there's one worldview that we just talked about, this hierarchical system that is dominance oriented, power over others, only maintainable through violence. That's not working. It has never worked. And now we're at the point of polycrisis, like real existential crises because of it. So I don't think we really have alternatives. We have to figure something out. It's not looking great, but this has happened before. Entire worlds have collapsed in the human history, and humans have survived to build new things. But the only thing I think I can really say is what I just described to me illustrates the limits of the male supremacist imagination. People who can't imagine anything different. And yet so many of us can imagine lots of new worlds. And so I would say that that's how I'd answer your question. I know what it's not.
Thank you so much, Soraya, for joining us here today. And the last thing that we like to ask all of our guests is to finish the sentence, I have the right to. Is there something that you could share with us that is meaningful to you in that statement?
I mean, I think, to echo your mother, I think saying I have the right to speak freely without fear is an important statement to make still. I think that's a very important statement, because men who defend an extremist libertarian free speech ideology, I don't think they've really ever had to live with the fear of speaking freely. For them, safety is the opposite of free speech. They think that other people's safety necessarily means they don't have free speech. But for most of us, to speak at all, we have to have some safety, and it has to be explicit. Whereas for a lot of people with power, they take that safety for granted, And so I think we need to talk about what that means, especially now in this very troubling era of generative AI. I mean, when you talk about something like deepfakes, what we're really talking about is mis and disinformation. And that's so completely corrosive to democracy and planetary well-being right now. Like, those are the same things. So the ability to speak freely without threat today is even harder for minoritized people, in which I include women. Even though we make up more than 50% of any population, we're still a minoritized political class. So I have the right to speak freely without fear of threat is how I would finish the sentence.
And a very, very important one to remember at that.
Soraya, it has been an honor and a privilege to be able to learn from you and your experiences and your insights on feminism and what it means to teach our young people about the importance of consent and growing in community.
Well, I'm just delighted to be here. Always love talking to you and very proud to see the expansion of your work. Really, it's so important. So thank you all for what you're doing.
And with that note, Soraya, I just want to recognize that when Chessy was Jane Doe, you were out there sending letters and supporting her voice and behind the scenes. So you have been an inspiration, a support, and keep on speaking out, Soraya. The world needs you.
You too. So thank you.
Thank you. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Remember, education, advocacy, and courage are all part of creating change. And each of us has the power to make a difference. We'll see you next time on Aspire.
Thank you so much for listening. Like and subscribe to the podcast on all platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends about Aspire. Follow us on social media at I Have the Right To. Learn more about workshops and programming available for students, educators, parents, and community members at IHaveTheRightTo.org.